Welcome to the Buddhism unit. I'm going to talk today about Buddhism, just briefly. Buddhism was started by a guy named Siddhartha Gautama, and he was the founder of Buddhism. Siddhartha was actually a prince. He was born in India to a king, and his mother died while in childbirth, or shortly thereafter. And he was raised by his father. But before he was conceived, or before he was, before he was conceived, his mother had a dream that she was going to have a baby, and that the baby would be of some, she had this obscure dream, and so she went to the sages and asked, what does this dream mean? And they said, well, you're going to have a baby, and it will either be a great king, and he will unite all of India and be a king of all of India instead of these various little kingdoms that existed throughout India, or he will be a wise sage. He will be a great wandering sage that is, of religious renown. And so she said, okay, that's great. Well, after he was born and his father was raising him, his father, on the other hand, was not such a big fan of this sage thing. He was a king, and he wanted his son to be the great king and unite India. It was something that would be quite preferred. And so he said, he basically just said, he wanted to protect him from the world and keep him from that life of pursuing religion. And so he he gave him all the riches that a palace could afford, women, dancing, wine, whatever. He lived a life of pleasure and happiness all throughout his upbringing. And then he was married, and he was married to actually his cousin, his beautiful cousin, although that wouldn't necessarily have been anything strange or whatever for then, or probably even for a lot of countries today. And they went on, they had a child. But at some point during this period, around the time when he had a son, he had gone out from the palace a few times. And on his first trip out, he saw an old man. He had never seen an old man before. And he asked his attendant, what's this? And his attendant said, well, that's change. People get old. They change, they get old, and you will change, and you'll become an old man. He said, we're not all young men. He said, oh, okay. So then he went on another time, and he saw a sick man. And he said, what's that? And he said, well, that's sickness. None of us stay healthy our entire lives. We all will eventually become ill, and that's just part of life. And so then he goes on another time and he sees a corpse. He'd never seen a corpse before, and he asked what it was. He said, that's death. Eventually, we all reach the stage where our body is dead, and even you will die. And he said, oh, okay. And so he went out a fourth time, and he saw a monk. And he said, what's that? And he said, well, that's a monk. He's trying to reach enlightenment and trying to avoid this life, not avoid the life, but trying to, through his spirituality, overcome, basically, the suffering of this life. And so Siddhartha realized at that point that there was something that, the life was mainly suffering, that there's pain, and there's suffering, and there's a lot of horrible things in it, but that through a process of religion, he could perhaps overcome it. So he ends up leaving his family. His wife had had a young baby, and he left in the middle of the night and went out on a journey to find enlightenment. And he does reach that. I won't tell you the whole story because I think there's a video from PBS that just does a great job with that, and it's about an hour in length. It's 2 hours in length, the video, but the first hour is really going through these stories in good detail and very interesting and very well done. So I think you'll enjoy that. But as far as the video goes, that's the first hour or whatever. But let me finish up here. Anyway, but he goes on and he reaches a point of enlightenment, and essentially he gets to this point and he becomes enlightened, and that's what the Buddha means. Buddha means the enlightened one. And essentially, the Buddha is not a god. The Buddha is not an incarnation of God or anything. He is simply a man who reached enlightenment, and he became a teacher of his path to reach enlightenment, of how you become an enlightened person. And so the Buddhists, keep in mind, are not necessarily that much into God. They're more I mean, they believe there's a God. I think most Buddhists do. But God's not really key. Even the gods die and are reborn into a new God, essentially. I mean, the gods are required to go through this path of rebirth, and it's sort of this constant path. But by reaching enlightenment, we can perhaps ease our transition into a better next life. That we can have a happier next life. We can have a life that allows us to focus more on spirituality and other things. So that's essentially what the Buddha teaches and the Buddhism holds. Now, there are various types of Buddhism, and even if you say one thing about Buddhism, a lot of times there's so many types. There's Mahayana, Tibetan, Theravada, Zen. I mean, those are just the ones I can think of off the top of my head. There are so many types of Buddhism that you have to realize that there are many paths to reaching enlightenment, and how people consider themselves Buddhists and follow those paths to enlightenment, but they do it in very different ways. For example, the traditional way is perhaps sort of a way of meditation, but there are also types like the Zen Buddhists who meditate, but they meditate on absurd thoughts, like what is the sound of one hand clapping, right? And that's sort of just, it doesn't make any sound. I mean, I always used to say, well, that kind of makes some sound if you do that, but it's actually, what is that sound? And you meditate on that idea, a young monk would, until they reach a point, maybe after a week or two, of just thinking about that one question, and they'll go back, and as soon as they realize the absurdity, they will slowly reach up and become a level of enlightenment. There's laughing Buddhists, which are actually an outgrowth of that, which spend their entire day just laughing, and that's what they do. I mean, and that through that laughter, it's a form of meditation, and they will reach a state of enlightenment through that. And so there's various types. There's types that are extremely pro vegetarianism, to the point, I believe I want to say it's the Theravada Buddhists, who there's some that are so extremely particular about their vegetarianism that they actually are more than just like a vegan. They actually won't eat anything, like even fruit, that has not fallen off of the vine or the tree. So, for example, if you want an apple, you don't go pick it. You wait for the apple to fall to the ground, and then you pick up the apple that's fallen on the ground and you eat that. If you want rice, you don't pick it from the plant or, cut the plant. You would wait for the rice to fall onto the ground and then pick it up and eat it. And so that is one type of Buddhist that's extreme. But then there's other types. For example, one of the things you'll see is in the video by the Chicago Police Department, they say, well, women aren't to touch the monks don't cross, like the males don't touch females and the females don't touch males, but normal Buddhists would. But that's not necessarily true. I mean, even the Dalai Lama at one point in the interview with Barbara Walters, she lets him kiss him on the cheek. I mean, so they're not particularly, that's not a particular, like universal. I mean, one Buddhist sect might be more particular about that over another one. Now, in addition to that, you also have things like I was telling you about the vegetarians that are extreme in it, and most Buddhists are vegetarian. But for example, the Dalai Lama has been known to say that when asked if he was a vegetarian, he said, "I'm a Buddhist, not a vegetarian." And I've seen interviews where he says that. And the key is that, I mean, first of all, you have to realize that Tibet is a mountainous nation. It's very cold, a lot of winter time, and there's not a lot of vegetation to pick and eat, like fresh vegetables and fruits. And so during the winter, they eat meat in that country. And so that's a big part of the diet of the Tibetan people. And so for people in that area to be vegetarian would be unusual. And so, it does vary, and he eats meat, and so you can't really, completely pinpoint all of these. But those are some key things. Most Buddhists are vegetarian, but not all of them. Now, as long as we're talking about the Dalai Lama, I would like to mention that it would be worth, you know, you're not required to watch it, but there is a video, it's a movie from probably the 90s by the director Martin Scorsese. Martin Scorsese is a famous American director. He did things like Goodfellas and Raging Bull and all kinds of things. And so he's very well known, very well regarded. But he did a movie about the Dalai Lama called Kundun. It's spelled K-U-N-D-U-N. K-U-N-D-U-N. Kundun. It's another name they give to the Dalai Lama. You can get it on Netflix, and you know, you might even be able to find it on YouTube or some other places, but it is definitely worth watching. It's a good movie. It shows some of the practices of the Dalai Lama, and you get to learn more about him. And I highly recommend that. It's just something to do one evening as you're watching it. Now, it does have subtitles in parts, so I mean, you know, I mean, that would be the only downside. I know, like, I don't have a very big TV screen, so I have to, when there's subtitles, I have to kind of sit closer, which always sort of annoys me. But the case, though, is that I should just get a bigger TV. I really should, you know. But anyway, that's a whole other point. But then the other thing is that as far as that goes, I mean, it does a very good job. It shows some very interesting things. Like the Buddhists will spend years, or not years, but months designing these elaborate sand artworks, and then they'll just sweep them up. And they show that. And they also show the practice that's common in Tibet, where they actually chop up the body of a deceased person and feed them to the birds. And so there's some interesting scenes that you might also find very interesting about Buddhism. And then finally, the other thing I'll mention about the Buddha, or the Dalai Lama, as long as I'm talking about that, I find always interesting is his brother was also believed to be in reincarnation. The Dalai Lama is believed to be the reincarnation of the previous Dalai Lama. And he was a little boy. They came and they found him and they said, oh, this guy appears to be the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama. And they took him through a series of tests and he passed. And they took him and they began his training and, you know, sort of become, you know, his soul had reborn into this little boy that is now this grown man, the Dalai Lama. But what's interesting is his brother, he came from a very religious family, kind of in the middle of nowhere at the edge of Tibet, along the China border. And his brother was also believed to be the reincarnation of another great religious Buddha or religious leader. And so his brother is actually also a highly regarded religious leader. Neither of them live in India, in Tibet anymore, because the Chinese overtook it and reclaimed it as part of China, and they fled, and they killed most of the monks that remained. So they fled. The Dalai Lama lives in India, although he travels to the United States. And his brother, who is also a Buddhist leader, actually lives in Indiana, of all places. So I always find, that's the interesting fact I always find about that. So anyway, I would highly recommend that video, as well as just, there's a lot of good videos and stuff in this chapter that I think, that one is about 2 hours, the one from PBS, but it is well worth watching. All right, thank you.